Tonight, you are here for something quiet and slow, a true crime story told with care, and with enough distance to let your mind rest. So if you are listening from a dark bedroom, or a dim living room, or a place where the day has finally loosened its grip, allow yourself to settle in. If you can, lower the brightness on your screen. Let your shoulders sink. Let your jaw unclench. There is nothing you need to solve tonight. There is nothing you need to figure out. This story will move at a calm pace, like footsteps on an empty street, steady and unhurried, with room to breathe between the facts. True crime, when told gently, becomes less about shock and more about understanding. It becomes a record of what happened, how people responded, and what the truth looked like when it was slowly pulled into the light. And sometimes it becomes a reminder that life can appear ordinary right up until the moment it changes. Tonight's case is one of the most well-known and widely discussed cases in modern American true crime. It is a story that began in a quiet California town in the final days of 2002, at the edge of the holiday season, when many households were still lit with small decorations and soft indoor lights, when people were still shopping for last-minute gifts or wrapping paper or groceries for family dinners. It is the case of Laci Peterson. Laci was a young woman living in Modesto, California. She was married to Scott Peterson, and in late December of that year, she was pregnant, approaching the final stretch of her pregnancy. People who knew her described her as warm and social, someone who kept close connections, someone whose presence left an impression because it felt friendly and bright. Modesto itself, at the time, was the kind of place that could feel steady and familiar. It was not a town where most people expected their lives to become national news. It was made of neighborhoods, driveways, supermarkets, routine commutes, and the quiet rhythms that define most communities, especially around the holidays. But what happened in this case did not remain local. It expanded, slowly at first, and then all at once. It became a story shaped by search teams and investigators, by headlines and television cameras, by courtrooms, and by debates that would stretch on for years. There are true crime cases that unfold like a long, distant echo. The public hears about them later, after most of the investigation has already taken place. And then there are cases like this one, where the investigation becomes a kind of live event, where every development is watched in real time, where the outside world presses closer and closer, and the story begins to feel less like a single tragedy and more like a national fixation. As we go through this case tonight, we will stay grounded in confirmed facts. We will keep a clear separation between what is officially established and what has been argued, disputed, or interpreted differently over time. This is important, not only because accuracy matters, but because in a case this famous, the noise can sometimes become louder than the evidence. We will also keep the descriptions calm and non-graphic. This is a channel for sleep, and while we will not avoid the seriousness of the subject, we will speak about it with restraint. The goal is to tell the story respectfully, without sensationalism, and without turning real loss into entertainment. The case begins on Christmas Eve. It begins with a morning that, for one household, may have seemed simple and ordinary at first. The kind of morning where the air outside feels cool, where streets move a little slower, where the day carries the quietness that comes before celebrations. And then, with time, it begins to change. One of the reasons this case became so gripping to the public is because it seemed to contain so many contrasts. A missing pregnant woman during the holidays, a husband speaking to the media, a community search, a growing national spotlight, and, at the center of it all, a question that felt unbearable in its simplicity. Where is Laci Peterson? In the early days, the story was framed as a disappearance. The language was that of hope and searching, of missing posters, of phone calls and volunteer efforts, of people scanning streets and parks and open spaces, willing the outcome toward safety. But as the investigation continued, the focus shifted. And with that shift came a different kind of weight, the kind that sits heavy on a story and changes the way every detail is viewed. This case would eventually lead to an arrest. It would lead to a trial watched by millions. It would lead to a verdict that, even years later, still sits in the public imagination, still debated in discussions about evidence, media influence, and how true crime stories become larger than the lives they began with. But tonight, we will take it slowly. We will begin at the beginning, with the place, the people, the timeline, and the first moments when something felt wrong. So, as you listen, allow the story to carry itself forward like a quiet current. You do not need to hold on to every name or every timestamp. You can let the facts drift past you, gently, the way headlights pass along a dark road, and if you feel sleep coming, you can let it come. Because this is not a story you must stay awake to finish. This is a story told in the soft hours, when the outside world grows quiet, when the mind is allowed to slow down, and when even heavy topics can be held carefully, without rushing. So take one more deep breath, let your body settle, and when you are ready, we will begin. Before this story became headlines, it was simply a life in motion, quiet and ordinary in the way most lives are. It was the end of December, with the holiday season settling over a town that moved at a steady pace, where mornings still felt routine and familiar, and where the biggest concerns for most people were simple things: getting through errands, making dinner, preparing for family time. Modesto, California sits in the Central Valley, a place shaped by neighborhoods and wide roads, local stores, and the everyday patterns of working life. It is not a city most people look at and imagine becoming the center of a national story. It is the kind of place where the days can blur together gently, and where the familiar becomes its own kind of comfort. In that setting was Laci Peterson. She was 27 years old in late 2002, and she was pregnant with her first child. Those who knew her often described her as warm and sociable, someone who kept close contact with friends and family, and someone who did not disappear into the background. She had the kind of presence that made people feel remembered, and her relationships mattered to her. She had grown up in California, and by the time she was married, she was settled into adult life in a way that many people recognize: a home, a spouse, plans for the future that were beginning to take a more permanent shape. The months leading up to the end of 2002 were filled with the kind of preparation that comes with pregnancy, where time seems to move both slowly and quickly. Days feel long, but milestones arrive without warning. Laci and Scott Peterson lived together in Modesto, in a neighborhood where many houses looked similar from the street, with driveways and lawns and the quiet privacy that comes with suburban life. From the outside, the picture seemed stable: a young married couple preparing to welcome a child. A season of change, but the hopeful kind. And when a family is expecting a baby, even the small details of life begin to feel meaningful. Conversations shift toward names, plans, appointments, what needs to be purchased, and what can wait. The future becomes something that feels close enough to touch. There is a special kind of anticipation in that stage of life, where everyone imagines the first moment of meeting the baby, the first weeks at home, the first time holding something fragile and new. In the days leading up to Christmas, the world was full of familiar holiday movement. Streets and shops became more crowded. People rushed to finish last-minute errands. Phones rang more often. Families planned gatherings. And in homes across Modesto, there were lights in windows and quiet expectations carried from room to room. For those close to Laci, she was not a name on a screen. She was a person in their lives, someone they could call, someone they checked in on, someone they looked forward to seeing. She was a daughter, a friend, a wife, and soon a mother. She belonged to a network of people who held her in the center of their ordinary days without realizing how quickly those days could change. And that is what makes this part of the story so important to hold gently. Because when a case becomes famous, the person at its center can slowly turn into a symbol, a headline, a photograph repeated so many times that the public begins to feel ownership over it. But before any of that, Laci was simply living her life, moving through winter days, surrounded by plans that were still unfolding. There is a particular quietness to the day before Christmas. It carries a strange calm beneath the busy moments, as if the world knows it is about to pause. For many people, it is a day of final preparations. It is a day of lists and small tasks and thoughts drifting ahead toward celebrations. And for Laci, Christmas Eve began like the kind of day that did not announce itself as important. It began like countless other mornings do, with the assumption that what comes next will be normal, that the day will move forward and end the way it always does. Most true crime stories begin this way, in hindsight, not with warning signs and dramatic foreshadowing, but with ordinary life that only later becomes precious. Because once something is taken away, people look back and search for meaning in everything that came before. They remember the last phone calls, the last plans, the last casual words spoken without knowing they would become the last. In Modesto, at the end of 2002, the world was still moving normally. And then, in a way that no one in that circle could have predicted, it stopped. Christmas Eve in 2002 fell on a Tuesday, and in Modesto, California. It was the kind of winter day that looked ordinary from the outside. The streets were busy in places where people were finishing errands. But many neighborhoods stayed quiet, as if the day was holding its breath before the holiday. This is the day that would later be examined in slow motion, with every remembered detail treated like it might hold an answer. But in the moment, it was simply a day in someone's life. A day that began the way days usually do, with small routines and familiar surroundings, with no clear sign of what was about to follow. Based on confirmed reporting and investigation timelines, Laci Peterson was last seen on the morning of December 24th. The exact movements of that morning have been discussed and debated for years, but there are core points that remain consistent in most official summaries. Laci was at home in Modesto. She was pregnant, nearing the end of her pregnancy, and she was preparing for the holiday. Like many people on Christmas Eve, she had small tasks to do, small plans forming inside the quiet rooms of a house. One of the details that became widely known early on was that Laci had a dog, a golden retriever named Mackenzie. The presence of the dog would later become important to the timeline, not because it proved a single explanation, but because it helped investigators understand something very simple: that Laci, at least for a time that morning, was engaged in ordinary home life. Scott Peterson, her husband, told investigators and later spoke publicly about his own movements that day. According to his account, he left the home that morning. He later said he went to his warehouse, and later still, he traveled to the Barkley Marina, about an hour and a half away, where he said he went fishing. The marina and the decision to go there would become one of the most talked about elements of the entire case. But at this point in the story, we are still in the hours when no one fully understood what was happening. The day had not yet turned into a search. The day had not yet turned into an investigation. In Scott Peterson's account, he returned home later that afternoon and found that Laci was not there. According to this timeline, that was the moment when concern began to sharpen into something more urgent. A missing person case, especially at first, often lives in a fragile space between explanation and fear. People wonder if the person stepped out for a moment, if there was a misunderstanding, if a phone battery died, if something simple can account for the silence. But because Laci was pregnant and close to her due date, the concern was immediate. When someone is expecting a child, people tend to keep closer watch, and absence carries a different weight. It does not feel like ordinary distance. It feels like something has interrupted a life that was supposed to be moving toward a new beginning. When Scott realized Laci was not home, a chain of calls and actions began, and soon after, law enforcement became involved. A missing person report was filed, and in the hours that followed, the story began to change shape. It began to move from private worry into public alarm. In the earliest public descriptions, the idea was that Laci had been out walking the dog in the neighborhood. That detail became widely circulated, and it influenced how people first pictured what happened. In many missing person cases, the earliest assumptions create a kind of mental map. People imagine the last simple action, and then they imagine where it might have gone wrong. But as time passed, aspects of that early idea became part of dispute and debate. Over the years, questions were raised about whether Laci did, in fact, leave the house to walk the dog that morning, or whether the dog ended up outside by other means. This is one of those moments where it is important to keep the boundary clear. The confirmed facts are these. Laci was home on the morning of Christmas Eve. Laci was later reported missing. The dog was found outside and later returned home, and that element of the story became important. The precise sequence of events around the dog and what it proved became an area of disagreement. In other words, there is a difference between what was said early on, what was later questioned, and what can be firmly proven. And the reason this matters is because this case became so public so quickly. And public stories have a way of hardening into certainty, even when the underlying details are not fully settled. What is not disputed is the speed with which the concern grew. Because by late afternoon and evening, Laci had not returned, and the situation did not feel like a simple delay. As law enforcement began to respond, the case took on the familiar structure of early missing person investigations. Officers gather basic information, timelines are established, friends and relatives are contacted. The home becomes a place of interest, not necessarily suspicion at first, but because it is the starting point, the last confirmed location. And outside the home, the surrounding neighborhood becomes the first search area. People look at streets and sidewalks and nearby parks. They check places that are easy to reach on foot. They ask if anyone saw anything. They listen for the smallest details that could have meaning. Christmas Eve is a day when many people are home, but it is also a day when many people are distracted. Some are traveling, some are cooking, some are doing last-minute shopping. The environment is busy in some places and quiet in others, and that mixture can make it difficult to know what might have been noticed, or what might have slipped past without leaving an impression. As the evening deepened, the case expanded outward. Calls went to friends and family. People began to gather. The house became a point of movement, where worry moved through rooms and settled into silence. There is something uniquely heavy about a disappearance during a holiday. The contrast is sharp. In other homes, lights are bright and music plays. In other homes, people laugh and plan meals. And in one home, the air turns still, and every sound feels too loud. The missing person report brought the case into official channels. And once a case becomes official, it begins to produce paperwork, records, and steps that are later reviewed again and again. Names of officers, times of calls, lists of questions asked and answered. It becomes a story not only told by memory, but recorded by systems. At this stage, the public did not yet know what this case would become. It was still early, still open, still held inside the possibility that Laci could be found alive, that something had happened which could be explained and resolved. And that is important to remember, because in the first hours and the first days, the people searching were operating on hope. Hope shapes the way people move through uncertainty. It keeps them searching longer. It keeps them calling again. It keeps them scanning sidewalks and ditches and empty lots. It keeps them imagining that the next turn in the story will be gentle instead of devastating. When the story first began to spread, Laci's pregnancy was central to how people understood the urgency. She was not only missing as a person, but as an expectant mother nearing the end of her pregnancy, and that created a sense of alarm that traveled fast. The case began to spread beyond the neighborhood, beyond Modesto, and then beyond California. It became a story people heard in other states while shopping or driving or wrapping gifts. It became something that interrupted other people's holidays, because the question at the heart of it was so simple and so unsettling. How does someone vanish from an ordinary day? As the night arrived on Christmas Eve, the Peterson home and the people around it moved into that first long stretch of waiting. Waiting for news, waiting for a phone call, waiting for the kind of update that would make the world feel stable again. But the hours passed, and in that passing time, the case began to shift from concern to urgency, and from urgency into something else entirely. Because when someone is missing, every hour that moves forward without contact becomes harder to explain. And behind all of the human emotion, the investigation itself was beginning to form. The first questions were being asked. The first assumptions were being tested. The first details were being written down. Christmas Eve ended without answers, and Christmas Day arrived with the same silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that presses against a family and makes it hard to breathe. In the next part of the story, the search begins in earnest. The response grows larger. More people become involved. More attention arrives. And the case, which started as a private fear in one household, becomes something that a city and then a nation begins to watch. For now, though it is still the earliest moment, the first day, the day that would be repeated again and again in courtrooms, in interviews, and in headlines, until December 24th became a date people recognized without needing to be told why. A day that began ordinary and ended with a disappearance that did not yet have a name. As Christmas Eve moved toward evening, the situation shifted from worry into something more structured and urgent. At first, a missing person case can sit in a strange space, where loved ones feel alarmed, but still want to believe there is an explanation that will arrive at any moment. A delayed phone call, an unexpected visit, a simple misunderstanding that will be cleared up as soon as someone answers. But as the hours passed on December 24th, and Laci Peterson did not return, that space began to close. The absence began to feel heavier. The possibility of a harmless reason started to lose ground, and the need for help, official help, became unavoidable. A missing person report was filed with the Modesto Police Department. In confirmed accounts of the timeline, this report was made on Christmas Eve, after Scott Peterson returned home and said he realized Laci was not there. The initial information provided to officers would become the foundation of the early search, where she was last believed to be, what she might have been doing, what she was wearing, what her routine usually looked like. This early stage of any investigation has its own rhythm. Officers gather details carefully, knowing that the first description can shape the direction of everything that follows. They ask questions that might sound simple, but have real importance. When was the last confirmed contact? Who spoke to her last? Were there plans for later in the day? Was anything unusual noticed in the home? Were doors locked? Were lights left on? Was anything missing that might suggest travel? And in the background, while the questions are being asked, a family begins to experience that first stretch of helpless waiting. Because once a report is made, the situation becomes real in a new way. It is no longer only a private fear. It becomes a case with an official record, and with it, a quiet acknowledgement that something may have gone wrong. In the earliest hours, searches often begin close to home. That is where the last confirmed location is, and that is where the most immediate answers might be found. Officers and volunteers typically look at the surrounding streets and sidewalks, nearby parks, open fields, and any path a person might have taken on foot. In Laci's case, the early understanding based on what was told in those initial reports, was that she might have gone out for a walk in the neighborhood. That direction mattered. It shaped where people looked first and how they pictured the disappearance. It made the search feel like something that could be resolved within a few blocks, within a few hours. The dog, Mackenzie, became a part of this early picture. The dog was found wandering with a leash on and was later brought back home by a neighbor. That detail was widely reported and became one of the first pieces of the timeline that many members of the public heard. It created a specific image in people's minds: Laci walking the dog, something interrupting that walk, the dog returning alone. At this stage, it is important to stay with what is confirmed. The dog was found outside with a leash, and the dog returned home. The exact meaning of that detail has been argued about later, but in the early hours, it was treated as a serious clue. Investigators and searchers would naturally want to trace the most likely path of a walk, check nearby areas, and ask neighbors if they had seen anything. This is also the point where a missing person case becomes communal. Friends, relatives, and neighbors begin to join the search. People who have never met the missing person will still show up because there is a quiet instinct in most communities to help when someone might be in danger. And Christmas Eve, for many people, meant they were home and available, even as the holiday carried on around them. Search teams and officers would have looked for anything out of place: an abandoned personal item, a sign of struggle, a piece of clothing, a footprint in an area where footprints do not usually appear. Sometimes early searchers find nothing at all, and sometimes the absence of evidence becomes its own kind of message, though it is never a conclusion by itself. That first night, the situation was still new enough that the priority was finding Laci quickly, because in missing person cases, time is important. The longer someone is missing, the larger the world becomes, and the harder it is to search effectively. The first hours offer the most limited search area, the most recent memory of witnesses, the best chance of someone noticing something small. But that night, there was no immediate resolution. As the search efforts continued, investigators would have begun building a clearer picture of Laci's habits and routines. What time she typically woke up, whether she usually walked in the morning, whether she had appointments or plans, whether she had recently spoken about concerns or fears, whether anything had changed in her behavior leading up to that day. They would also have started contacting people close to her, family members, friends, anyone who might have spoken to her recently, anyone who might have received a call or a message. Sometimes a missing person case is solved quickly because someone remembers an offhand detail, a casual mention of meeting someone, or a plan that seemed too small to matter. But as December 24th turned to night, and then into the early hours of December 25th, Laci remained missing. And then something else began to happen. The case began to move beyond the initial search and into the first stages of a public appeal. Because when law enforcement cannot locate someone quickly, attention becomes a tool. Flyers are made, details are released, descriptions are shared. The hope is that someone, somewhere, saw something and did not realize it mattered. In the Peterson case, that public attention arrived quickly. The circumstances were unusual. A pregnant woman missing on Christmas Eve, a family waiting through the holiday without answers. Those details alone were enough to make people pay attention. And once a story gains attention, it can spread faster than investigators can control. This early stage also brings a certain pressure, even if no one says it out loud. Families feel pressure to stay hopeful in front of others. Communities feel pressure to help. Police departments feel pressure to act quickly and visibly. And the missing person becomes the center of a growing circle of concern, all of it turning around the same question: where did she go? When you look back at missing person cases that later become major national stories, there is often a moment like this. The first night, the first hours, the beginning of the search. It is the point where hope is still strong enough to fill a room, but fear is starting to move in beside it. Because every time the phone does not ring, silence begins to feel like an answer. Christmas morning arrived without Laci, and even in the softness of the holiday, even with the world still trying to celebrate, the situation did not pause. The investigation continued. The search continued. And the case began to settle into the reality that this was not going to be solved with one quick call or one simple discovery. It was going to take time, and as time moved forward, the case would expand outward, pulling more people into it. It would become larger than a neighborhood search. It would become a media story, a national story, and eventually a courtroom story. But in these earliest days, the focus remained on finding Laci, finding her alive, bringing her home. And as the search widened, as investigators continued to collect information, they began to look at more than the streets outside. They began to look at the details of the case itself. The statements being made, the timelines, the places connected to that day. Because when someone disappears and there is no clear sign of where they went, investigators have to consider every possibility. They have to hold hope in one hand and doubt in the other, moving forward carefully, not assuming too soon, but not ignoring what might be uncomfortable. And that is where the case began to change. Not in one dramatic moment, but gradually, like a shadow moving across a room. The missing person report had been filed. The first searches had begun, and still, Christmas passed without answers. In the next stage of the story, the case moves into a wider spotlight, and the first waves of public attention begin to shape what comes next. As the first day became the second, and Christmas Day passed into the day after, the case began to change in a way that many families do not expect when a loved one goes missing. At first, the concern is personal and private, held close inside a home, shared between relatives, friends, and the officers assigned to help. But when a disappearance stays unresolved, attention often arrives from the outside. And once attention arrives, it brings both help and pressure. In the early stages, media coverage can be a tool. It spreads information quickly. It increases the number of eyes looking. It brings phone calls and tips that might not otherwise exist. In the best situations, it creates momentum that leads to a breakthrough. But media attention also changes the feeling of a case. The missing person becomes a public figure. The family becomes a public story. The home becomes a location that strangers recognize. And the investigation, which should be quiet and careful, begins to unfold under a bright light. In the case of Laci Peterson, the circumstances were the kind that attracted attention fast. A pregnant woman missing during the holidays, a young couple, a community search growing each day. The details were simple to understand, and the emotional weight was immediate. The story moved from Modesto into the broader news cycle, and within a short time, it was being discussed well beyond California. People heard about it at work. People heard about it while driving. People heard about it during holiday gatherings, when a short television segment could shift the mood in an entire room. This first wave of media coverage had a particular tone to it. In the beginning, many stories focus on hope. They feature photographs of the missing person, descriptions of the last known movements, and direct appeals to the public. They ask viewers to look at the face, remember the details, and call in anything that seems important. Those early images of Laci became familiar quickly. Her face, her smile, the way she was presented in family photographs. The public was not only absorbing information, they were forming an emotional connection, imagining her as someone they might know, someone who belonged safely in a home, not lost somewhere unseen. And as this attention grew, it also drew in more volunteers. More people arrived to help with searches. More communities became aware. More areas were checked. Sometimes this kind of attention can create the sense that the whole world is looking, and that, if the whole world is looking, answers must come. But there is another side to it. Once media attention grows, every detail becomes a point of discussion. Small facts become topics. Ordinary movements become suspicious or significant, depending on who is speaking. People who have never met anyone involved begin to form opinions, and those opinions spread faster than the investigation itself. With Laci's case, the attention brought more microphones, more cameras, and more questions. And it brought a new kind of responsibility for those closest to her. Because now they were not only searching, they were also speaking, communicating, trying to keep the story present in the news. Public appeals became a part of the case. Family members and those involved would ask for help. They would ask for sightings. They would ask for anyone with information to come forward. This is one of the most difficult roles a family can be asked to play, because it means turning private grief into public messaging, repeating the same request again and again, even when the heart is exhausted. In many cases, the public also begins to focus closely on the spouse or partner of the missing person. This is not always fair, and it is not always accurate, but it is common. The reason is simple. A spouse is usually the closest adult to the missing person. A spouse is often the person with the most knowledge about routines, relationships, and the final hours before the disappearance. So, as Laci's case became more public, Scott Peterson also became more visible. His words, his presence, and his behavior in front of cameras would be analyzed closely. And once that happens, the case shifts again. It becomes not only about the missing person, but about the way others are responding to the disappearance. At this stage, it is important to remain grounded. Media attention can create narratives quickly, but narratives are not evidence. It can create a story shape that feels emotionally satisfying, but investigations require proof, not impressions. Still, impressions matter because they shape public pressure. They influence how a case is discussed, how tips are interpreted, and how people view those involved. And in a high-profile case, public pressure becomes a constant presence, like wind against a door that never fully closes. In the Peterson case, the public interest continued to increase. More coverage led to more discussion, and more discussion led to more coverage. This cycle can become self-feeding, and soon the case is not simply a missing person investigation. It is a national event. As days passed, the tension grew. Christmas ended, New Year's approached, and Laci remained missing. The longer a person remains missing, the more the mind begins to shift from hope toward fear. That shift does not happen in one clean moment. It happens in stages. One day of silence, then another, and eventually, people begin to prepare themselves emotionally for outcomes they do not want to imagine. At the same time, investigators continued working behind the scenes, following leads and assessing information. But in public, what people saw were search efforts, media statements, and an ongoing mystery that did not yet have an answer. A missing person case under intense media attention becomes a fragile thing. On one hand, it can generate more tips and more help. On the other, it can contaminate the environment around it, filling the space with opinions, rumors, and confident assumptions. In Laci Peterson's case, this first wave of attention was only the beginning. The case was still unfolding, but the public was already deeply engaged. And as the spotlight grew brighter, another shift was beginning, quieter and more serious than the first. The focus was starting to narrow. Investigators were starting to look more carefully at the details of December 24th. The timeline, the statements, the choices made that day, because when searches bring no clear result, attention begins to turn inward, toward the people and places closest to the disappearance, not as an accusation by default, but as a necessity. And in the calm, slow progression of an investigation, this is often where the story turns. where the case begins to move away from the idea of a sudden disappearance on a neighborhood walk, and toward the harder questions of what might have happened before anyone even realized something was wrong. And for the public watching from afar, it was around this stage that the story began to feel less like a missing person mystery and more like something darker, something more permanent. Not because proof had been revealed in a dramatic way, but because the silence was continuing, and the world was listening closely for what would break it. In the days after Laci Peterson was reported missing, the attention around the case continued to grow. Search efforts expanded, tips began to arrive, and investigators worked to assemble a clear timeline. And as that happened, one person remained at the center of nearly every question, not because the public chose it at random, but because of the simple fact of proximity. Scott Peterson was Laci's husband. In almost any missing person investigation involving a married couple, investigators will spend time understanding the spouse's account. This is not automatically suspicion. It is procedure. A spouse often has the most direct knowledge of routines, recent plans, and the smallest changes that might matter. A spouse can help establish the last confirmed contact. A spouse can identify what feels normal and what does not. But in a case with heavy media coverage, that procedural focus quickly becomes public scrutiny. What begins as standard investigative work turns into speculation. And when a story is watched day by day, every statement can be replayed, judged, and interpreted in 100 different ways. In Scott Peterson's public comments and statements to investigators, the foundation remained consistent. He said that on the morning of Christmas Eve, he left home while Laci was still there. He said he went to his warehouse first, and later drove to the Barkley Marina, where he said he went fishing. He said he returned home later that day and found Laci missing, and that is when the missing person report was made. These statements were important because they formed the earliest timeline. Investigators needed to know where Scott had been, when he had been there, and how his movements could be confirmed. They needed to understand whether his account aligned with phone records, receipts, sightings, and any other objective detail that could be checked. In the early stages of the case, the public was still holding on to hope. Many people were still thinking in terms of an unexplained disappearance and a search that might end in relief. But as days passed and Laci remained missing, the emotional climate changed. And with that change, the way people heard Scott's words began to shift. One of the most discussed aspects of Scott Peterson's early public presence was the way he appeared in interviews. People watching on television often formed opinions based not on facts, but on tone, on facial expression, on perceived emotion. This is a delicate part of any true crime story, because human behavior in crisis does not follow a single script. Some people become visibly overwhelmed, some become numb, some appear calm because they are trying to hold themselves together, and some people, under intense pressure, may appear detached simply because they do not know how to exist in front of cameras while their private life is breaking apart. So while public opinion began to form, investigators continued with a more grounded approach. They focused less on impressions and more on evidence. They would have looked for confirmation of Scott's movements. They would have examined the claim of going to the warehouse and then traveling to the marina. They would have sought documentation that could support those details, because in any investigation, an account is not enough by itself. It must be tested. It must be backed by something outside of memory. At the same time, the case was developing at a rapid pace in the public eye. Posters and descriptions circulated. Volunteers searched. News stations repeated the story. And Scott Peterson, as the husband, became part of the face of the case. Family members and those close to Laci also appeared publicly, hoping that attention could bring answers. As this happened, Scott's words and behavior were not only analyzed, they were compared against the grief and urgency seen in others. And the contrast, whether meaningful or not, added fuel to the growing scrutiny. This is how pressure builds in high-profile cases. The public begins to feel that they can sense the truth through observation alone. They begin to treat instinct as evidence. And the internet, even in its earlier forms at the time, became a place where opinions multiplied quickly. But beneath that noise, investigators had to work carefully. Because if a case becomes too public too fast, there is always a risk that investigation becomes contaminated by rumor. Witnesses can be influenced by headlines. People can misremember what they saw. Tips can turn into a flood of false leads, not because people are lying, but because attention shapes perception. Still, some aspects of Scott Peterson's story remain central to how the case evolved. The Barkley Marina, where Scott said he went fishing, was a major location in the investigation. Over time, that detail would become one of the most debated points in the case. Because of the distance from Modesto, and because of what would eventually be found in that area later. But at this point in the timeline, the marina was still simply a place Scott said he had been. Investigators would have considered what that meant, how long he stayed, whether it fit the timeline, whether anyone saw him, whether there were records, receipts, or other indicators that supported that trip. And as that focus intensified, so did the questions around the relationship itself. In many true crime cases, when a spouse is scrutinized, the investigation begins to examine marital dynamics. Not because every marriage contains violence, but because relationships often hold motives when a crime has occurred. So investigators will look for signs of tension, conflict, financial stress, or separation. They will look for anything suggesting that the relationship was not what it appeared to be. This is also a moment where confirmed facts and later revealed information begin to diverge. In the early public story, the couple was presented as a young married pair expecting a child. That image was powerful. It shaped how people felt about the disappearance. It made the story more painful, more symbolic, more urgent. But as the investigation continued, information came forward that complicated that image. And one specific element would later become a turning point: an extramarital relationship. This detail, once it became known, would take the case from intense scrutiny into something sharper, something that felt to the public like a possible explanation for the disappearance. It is important to handle this carefully in calm storytelling, because the existence of an affair does not prove guilt in a criminal case. It may speak to character. It may speak to deception. It may provide motive in some narratives. But it is not proof by itself. A criminal case requires evidence that connects a person to a crime, not simply evidence that someone lived dishonestly. Still, as soon as this information surfaced, it changed the public's perception immediately. It also changed the investigation, because once investigators became aware of this relationship, they would have treated it as relevant. They would have looked at timelines, communication, and statements made to different people. They would have considered whether Scott Peterson had been presenting different versions of his life to different individuals. And in a case where someone is missing, any sign of secrecy or double life becomes significant. Not because it automatically means violence, but because it suggests the presence of hidden pressures. And hidden pressures are often where investigators find the motive or the breaking point. As Scott Peterson continued speaking publicly, and as media attention remained relentless, he became one of the most analyzed people in America at that time. And in that atmosphere, the case moved from being a community search into something broader and heavier. A story not only about a missing woman, but about suspicion inside the home. But again, it is important to stay grounded. At this stage, investigators were still working. The case was still open. Laci was still missing. And while suspicion was rising, nothing had yet been proven in court. The early scrutiny of Scott Peterson was a combination of normal procedure, media magnification, and growing public anxiety. And in the days ahead, the case would shift again. Not because of tone or perception, but because of a development that brought a new name into the story and a new direction into the investigation. a person who did not begin this story in Modesto, but whose involvement would change everything. As the investigation continued and the public attention remained intense, the case moved into a phase where new information began to emerge, not from search teams or neighborhood sightings, but from the private life of Scott Peterson. And in true crime, there are moments that change the direction of a case so clearly that everything before them starts to look like the beginning of a different story. This was one of those moments. In early January of 2003, a woman named Amber Frey came forward and contacted law enforcement. Amber lived in California, and she told investigators that she had been in a relationship with Scott Peterson in the weeks before Laci went missing. This information was significant, not because it was dramatic, and not because it was something the public wanted to hear, but because it created a direct contradiction between the image Scott had presented publicly and the life he had been living privately. For investigators, it was immediately relevant. Missing person cases rely on timelines, and the strongest timelines are the ones supported by objective facts. Phone records, meeting dates, locations, anything that can confirm where someone was and what they were doing without relying solely on memory. An undisclosed relationship could affect a timeline in several ways. It could reveal movements not previously mentioned. It could reveal communications that were hidden. It could reveal statements that do not match what had been said publicly. And in a case where a pregnant woman was missing, those contradictions mattered. According to Amber Frey's account, Scott Peterson had introduced himself to her and begun a relationship. The relationship progressed quickly. They spoke often. They spent time together. And at some point, Scott told her that he had lost his wife. This detail, while widely reported, is one of the reasons this became such a turning point. Because it was not only the existence of the relationship, but the story Scott had reportedly told, and the timing of that story, that changed the way the investigation viewed him. It is important to handle this part with clear boundaries between what is confirmed and what is interpreted. The confirmed core is this. Amber Frey came forward. Amber told investigators about the relationship, and investigators considered it serious enough that it became part of the official direction of the case. Over time, Amber also cooperated further with law enforcement, which included recorded phone calls that would later become evidence. This was not a rumor. It was not an anonymous tip without support. It was an identifiable person speaking directly to authorities, providing information that could be checked against records. And once this information was known to investigators, the case shifted. Because up until that point, public attention had been intense, but the disappearance could still be framed as an unknown. A missing person case with no confirmed explanation. But the moment investigators learned that Scott had been living a double life, the missing person case gained a new potential motive, and a new lens through which earlier statements could be examined. The public reaction was immediate and strong. In a case involving a missing pregnant woman, people were already emotionally invested. The idea that her husband had been in a secret relationship made many people feel that the story had finally revealed its darker shape. But emotional reaction is not the same as legal proof, and investigators still had to work carefully. An affair does not prove murder. An affair does not prove abduction. It does not prove any specific outcome. What it does prove is deception. And in criminal investigations, deception matters because it often points to motive, or to behavior that a person did not want exposed. In calm, true crime storytelling, it is important to say this plainly and gently. Many people live unfaithfully without committing violence. But when someone vanishes under suspicious circumstances, hidden relationships become a serious point of investigation because they reveal pressure, conflict, and the possibility of a life someone was trying to escape. Amber's decision to come forward also mattered because of timing. She contacted police while the search for Laci was still active. Laci was still missing. The case had not yet reached a courtroom stage. The public narrative was still forming, and investigators were still trying to locate her. Amber did not step into a finished story. Amber stepped into an unfolding one. Law enforcement took steps to verify what Amber said through records and documentation. In most investigations, claims like these are examined through phone logs, dates, movements, and other details that can confirm whether the relationship existed as described. As Amber cooperated, investigators also made a careful choice that is often made in cases where a person may become a key witness. They began to record conversations between Amber and Scott. These recorded calls were not meant to create drama. They were meant to preserve evidence. They captured tone, content, and statements made by Scott during a time when his wife was missing. For investigators, this was valuable because it provided unfiltered material, not a polished statement, not a media interview, but private conversation, recorded in real time. Later, these recordings would become some of the most discussed evidence in the case, not only because of what was said, but because of when it was said. During days when the public was still hoping that Laci would be found alive. As this turning point unfolded, Scott Peterson's public position began to weaken rapidly. The case had already been receiving media attention, but now that attention sharpened. It became more pointed, more skeptical, more accusatory. The story was no longer simply about a missing woman. It became about the possibility of betrayal at the center of the home. And with that shift, the investigation's focus also narrowed. Search efforts still continued, and law enforcement continued to receive tips. But now, investigators were applying deeper pressure to Scott's timeline. They were looking harder at the Barkley Marina trip. They were comparing statements. They were examining inconsistencies. They were considering motive through the lens of a life Scott may have been trying to preserve, or change, or escape. The case also began to show the first signs of public division. Some people believed the affair alone was enough to confirm Scott's guilt. Others cautioned that moral judgment is not the same thing as criminal evidence. And this division, as quiet as it may seem, became part of the atmosphere around the case for years to come. But even with all of this, Laci was still missing. And that fact remained at the center of everything. Because no amount of discussion about relationships could answer the most important question. Where was she? As January continued, investigators focused heavily on the areas connected to Scott's known movements. They paid attention to the marina, to surrounding regions, and to any location that could connect the timeline to a physical outcome. The case was beginning to move away from the early neighborhood search and toward a broader, more strategic investigation. And in true crime, that shift often means something difficult. It means that investigators are starting to believe the answer may not be found in a quick rescue. It may be found in evidence, in remains, in what is left behind. And soon, the case would reach a moment where the search was no longer only about finding a missing person. It was about finding the truth. Because not long after the turning point involving Amber Frey, another turning point would arrive. One that would anchor the case in a specific place and change the investigation permanently. Not through words, but through discovery. As the days moved forward and the case continued to unfold under intense public attention, the investigation entered a more focused phase. Early searches, especially in the first hours after a disappearance, tend to be wide and urgent. They involve neighborhoods, parks, open spaces, and the simple hope that someone will be found quickly. But when time passes without a clear outcome, an investigation changes. It becomes less about rushing outward in every direction, and more about narrowing in. It becomes about evidence. It becomes about pattern. It becomes about building a case that can hold up in reality, not just in public emotion. In the disappearance of Laci Peterson, that shift became more noticeable as January of 2003 continued. By this point, investigators were no longer only looking at the possibility that Laci had vanished on a walk in her neighborhood. They were looking closely at the timeline of Christmas Eve, at Scott Peterson's reported movements, and at areas connected to those movements that could be searched more carefully. And among all the locations that were now connected to this case, one stood out clearly: the Barclay Marina. Scott Peterson's trip to the marina on Christmas Eve was a fact that investigators treated seriously, and for understandable reasons. It was not because going fishing is unusual by itself. It was because of what that location represented. It was far enough away to raise questions. It was tied to a specific time. It was a place where the water creates its own kind of uncertainty, and where physical evidence can be difficult to recover. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement began to conduct more extensive searches connected to the bay. These searches were methodical. They involved specialized teams, equipment, and planning. Searching bodies of water is not like searching a neighborhood. It is slower, it is technically complex, and it often carries a deeper fear, because water searches are usually connected to worst-case possibilities. Still, investigators do not search the bay simply because it is dramatic. They search because the evidence and timeline lead them there. Because in a case with no confirmed location of the missing person, investigators have to follow the strongest paths first, even if they are uncomfortable. At the same time, searches continued in other areas as well. Tips came in from the public. People called with sightings. People reported things they had noticed. Vehicles, strangers, a person walking at a certain time, a sound, a movement that seemed out of place. Most tips in a major case do not lead anywhere. That is not because the public is unhelpful, but because memory is imperfect and fear can reshape what people think they saw. Once a case becomes national news, ordinary moments are reinterpreted through anxiety. A person walking a dog becomes suspicious. A parked vehicle becomes a clue. A casual glance becomes a remembered certainty. Investigators have to take these tips seriously, at least at first. They have to assess them, test them, and determine which ones can be supported by something solid. They have to separate noise from signal, and in a case this public, the noise can be overwhelming. During this period, the investigation also began to examine Scott Peterson more directly, not only through public statements, but through behavior, communications, and any evidence that could connect him to the disappearance. This is the part of a case where law enforcement begins to build direction, not simply a theory, but a strategy. It becomes less about asking what could have happened in every possible way, and more about asking what the evidence supports as most likely. In confirmed reports, Scott Peterson remained under heavy scrutiny. Investigators looked at the timeline of his day. They looked at the route to the marina. They looked at what was purchased, what was said, what could be confirmed through records, and they looked at whether his account remained stable when examined closely. They also continued to gather information about the relationship he had been hiding from Laci. The involvement of Amber Frey and the recorded phone calls became part of the investigative landscape, not because a relationship alone proves violence, but because deception and contradiction create investigative pressure. It becomes harder for a person to appear credible when there are already established lies. Around this time, law enforcement, surveillance, and monitoring became a visible part of the case. In many high-profile investigations, police will track a suspect's movements if they believe the person may attempt to flee or destroy evidence. They may monitor calls, they may observe behavior, and they may use the pressure of time itself to see if a person makes mistakes. Publicly, the case was now shifting towards suspicion. It was increasingly framed as more than a disappearance. Many members of the public began to believe that Laci had not simply vanished, but had been harmed. And because this shift was happening in full view of the media, there was also a growing debate about evidence. What had actually been found, what had not been found, what was known and what was assumed. At this stage, one of the difficulties in telling this case accurately is that many people remember the emotional narrative more than the investigative reality. People remember interviews, headlines, and the intensity of public opinion. But investigators were moving through a slower, quieter process, gathering what they could, step by step. And what they had at this point was not a single dramatic piece of proof. It was a picture forming gradually. A set of circumstances, a timeline, a pattern of deception, a location of interest, an absence of the missing person despite broad searches. In an investigation, the absence of evidence can sometimes become part of the evidence, but only in context. When someone disappears and there are no signs of voluntary departure, no confirmed sightings, no contact, and no clear reason to vanish, investigators begin to consider that the disappearance may not have been voluntary. Still, this is not the same as proof. It is a direction, a growing probability, and in court, probability is not enough. So investigators continued to search for something more, something physical, something undeniable, and this is where the bay remained central. Because water holds secrets differently than land. It erases tracks, it moves objects, it changes what is possible to recover, but it also leaves patterns. Tides move in predictable ways, drift follows currents, and when investigators commit to searching the water, they do so with the understanding that it may take time. Through January and into the following months, the case remained active and intense. The search efforts did not stop. The family continued to plead for information. Media coverage continued to press in from all sides, and investigators continued to narrow in on what they believed to be the strongest path forward. There is a quiet truth in this phase of the story. At a certain point, when someone is missing for long enough, an investigation stops expecting a miracle and starts preparing for a conclusion. Not a peaceful conclusion, a legal one. And as the case moved deeper into 2003, it was heading steadily toward that kind of conclusion. The public did not yet know how it would end, but the investigation was beginning to align around a central belief that Laci Peterson was not lost. She had been taken, and the person responsible was closer than anyone wanted to accept. Soon the investigation would be anchored by a discovery near the bay, a moment that would take the case out of uncertainty and place it into a new category entirely. Not a missing person case, but a murder case. And once that shift happens, the world never returns to the way it was before. By the spring of 2003, the investigation had been running for months, and the search for Laci Peterson had become something larger than the city of Modesto. The case was no longer just a local missing person report. It had become a story that people across the country recognized. A story that carried the weight of time passing without answers. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, hope did not vanish completely, but it began to change form. Families in these situations often hold on to hope because letting go feels like a second loss. But at the same time, reality becomes harder to ignore. Silence stretches, leads fade. The world keeps moving, even when one household feels frozen. In April of 2003, the case reached a development that would permanently change how it was understood. Human remains were discovered along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay, not far from the area connected to Scott Peterson's reported trip to the Barclay Marina on Christmas Eve. This discovery was not presented as a dramatic moment in the way television sometimes portrays it. In real investigations, these moments are often quiet at first. A report is made. Officers respond. The area is examined. Specialists become involved. Procedures follow. Even life-changing discoveries begin as careful steps and measured decisions. The remains were eventually identified as belonging to Laci Peterson and her unborn child. This identification, confirmed through official investigative processes, brought an end to the missing persons search in the form everyone had feared. It transformed the case from a disappearance into a homicide investigation. Because this is a channel for sleep, and because this subject deserves respect, we will not go into graphic or disturbing detail. It is enough to say that the discovery confirmed the outcome the family had been praying would never come. The person they were searching for was not waiting to be found alive somewhere unknown. The search was now about accountability, truth, and the path that led to this ending. When remains are found in a case like this, investigators immediately shift into a different mode. The priority becomes establishing what can be confirmed through forensic examination, through location, and through the broader pattern of evidence. A shoreline discovery is not only about identification, it is about understanding how the remains arrived there, and what that suggests about where the person may have been before. In this case, the bay became even more significant. It had already been central to the investigation because of Scott Peterson's statement that he had been at the Barclay Marina on the day Laci disappeared. Now, the fact that the remains were found in the same broad region added weight to the investigative direction that had been forming over time. That said, location by itself is not a complete story. Water carries, shifts, and changes what is possible to know with certainty. Investigators rely on known currents, tides, and environmental patterns, but they also understand that a bay can obscure as much as it reveals. Even when a discovery feels like confirmation, the details still matter, and the details must be examined carefully. For Laci's family, this moment marked a different kind of grief. Missing person cases hold people in a painful in-between state, where they do not know whether to mourn or hope. When remains are identified, the uncertainty ends, but the finality begins. It is the moment when the mind is forced to accept what the heart has been trying to reject. Public reaction was immediate. Many people who had followed the case from the beginning felt that this discovery confirmed what they had feared for months. And because the case had been so widely covered, the public did not experience this privately. It unfolded in headlines, news reports, and constant updates, turning a family's tragedy into a national moment. From an investigative standpoint, the discovery meant that the case now required a courtroom-ready foundation. It was no longer enough to suspect. Investigators now needed to prove, through evidence and testimony, who was responsible and how the crime had occurred. A homicide case is built not only on one discovery, but on the full chain of events leading up to it. This is also where the timing became critical. The remains were found months after Christmas Eve, which meant investigators had to work within the reality of time passing. They had to rely on what could still be recovered, what had been preserved, and what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Time does not only affect memory, it affects evidence, and it affects certainty. The discovery also intensified the scrutiny around Scott Peterson. By this stage, he had already become the primary focus of the investigation in the public mind. The affair with Amber Frey had already changed how people viewed him. His movements on Christmas Eve had already been examined repeatedly. Now, with remains found in the Bay Area, the connection many people had been drawing began to feel stronger and more direct. Again, it is important to keep the line clear between what is emotionally convincing and what is legally proven. A strong narrative is not the same as a strong case. But investigators were now operating in a world where the central facts were no longer open-ended. Laci had been found. The case had moved into its next phase. Around this same period, Scott Peterson's behavior and circumstances drew further attention from law enforcement. In mid-April of 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested. Authorities announced that he was being charged in connection with Laci's death and the death of the unborn child. Arrests in major cases often bring a sense of resolution to the public, but they are also the beginning of a long process. A charge is not a verdict. It is the formal declaration that investigators believe they have enough evidence to move forward, to present their case in court, and to ask a jury to decide. For many listeners, This point in the story can feel like the case has already ended. But in reality, it was shifting into a different kind of unfolding, slower and more procedural. Evidence would be presented, arguments would be made, facts would be challenged, and the case that had begun with a missing person report would become one of the most watched trials of its time. But the heart of the story remains simple and heavy. A woman who began Christmas Eve at home in Modesto did not get to finish the holiday. A family who expected a new life in the spring was forced into grief, and a community that once felt safe and familiar became the backdrop for a crime that people would talk about for decades. In true crime, there are moments that become fixed in time. This was one of them, not because it was sensational, but because it ended the hope that had carried the search forward. It replaced questions with finality, and it changed what the world was asking. Not where is she, but what happened, and who is responsible. By the time April of 2003 arrived, the case had already transformed in the eyes of the public. What began as a missing person search in Modesto had become a national story, shaped by weeks of media coverage, public appeals, and growing suspicion. And once Laci Peterson and her unborn child were identified after remains were discovered near the San Francisco Bay, the investigation entered a new phase with a different purpose. It was no longer focused on finding someone, it was now focused on proving what happened and proving who was responsible. In mid-April of 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested. Authorities announced that he would be charged in connection with the deaths of Laci Peterson and the unborn child. This was a major moment in the case, not because it provided immediate closure, but because it signaled that investigators believed they had enough evidence to move forward with prosecution. An arrest in a high-profile case can feel like a conclusion to the public, but it is not the end of the legal process. In many ways, it is the beginning of the most difficult part, the part where evidence must be organized into a coherent argument, where facts are tested and challenged, and where the burden of proof becomes central. After the arrest, the case entered the formal criminal justice system. Prosecutors began preparing the foundation they would need to present in court. Defense attorneys began preparing their response, and the story that had been told through headlines and interviews now had to be examined through legal standards, rules of evidence, and courtroom procedure. One of the most important things to understand about this stage is that court cases are built slowly. People often imagine that there is one defining piece of proof that resolves everything. But many trials, especially those based on circumstantial evidence, rely on layers of details, timelines, behavior, records, and physical circumstances. Each piece may seem incomplete by itself, but the prosecution aims to show that taken together, the evidence leads to one clear conclusion. In the Peterson case, prosecutors would ultimately build their argument around several key themes that were already visible to the public by this point. Scott Peterson's movements on Christmas Eve, including the trip to the Barclay Marina, the discovery of remains in the Bay Area, the existence of the affair with Amber Frey, and the claim that Scott had described himself as having lost his wife before Laci was even reported missing. These details shaped the narrative that prosecutors would later present. But it is important to say clearly that narrative is not enough. In court, each of these points has to be supported through testimony, records, and evidence that meets legal standards. It must be shown, not simply suggested. As the case moved forward, Scott Peterson entered formal court proceedings. Charges were filed, hearings were held, decisions were made about evidence, about legal motions, and about what would be allowed before a jury. These early legal steps tend to be less visible than the trial itself, but they shape everything that comes later. One central issue in major trials is whether the defendant can receive a fair trial in the place where the crime occurred, especially when media coverage is intense. In cases that become nationally famous, it becomes difficult to find jurors who have not already formed opinions. This can lead to changes in venue, meaning the trial is moved to another county to reduce the influence of local publicity. In the Peterson case, the trial was ultimately moved away from Stanislaus County, where Modesto is located. It was moved to San Mateo County. This decision reflected the reality that the case had become so widely discussed that finding an unbiased jury in the original area could be difficult. While this legal process was unfolding, the public continued to watch closely. The Peterson case was not unfolding quietly in the background. It was unfolding with constant attention. Every court appearance became news. Every legal decision became a headline. And in that environment, the line between legal truth and public opinion can become blurred. For the prosecution, the goal was to present a clear, consistent picture to a jury. They needed to establish that Laci Peterson's death was not an accident and not the result of an unknown stranger, but the result of deliberate harm, and that Scott Peterson was responsible. For the defense, the goal was different. It was not necessarily to prove an alternate story with complete certainty, but to raise reasonable doubt. That is the legal threshold that matters most. If jurors cannot be sure beyond reasonable doubt, the law requires acquittal. In this case, the defense would argue that the investigation had been shaped by media pressure and assumptions. They would suggest that other possibilities existed, including the possibility that Laci had been harmed by someone else, and that the focus on Scott was not supported strongly enough by direct evidence. A key point in many discussions of this case is that much of the prosecution's case was circumstantial. Circumstantial evidence can still be powerful and legally valid, but it is different from direct evidence. Direct evidence is something like an eyewitness account of the act itself. Circumstantial evidence is evidence of surrounding facts that, taken together, suggest a conclusion. The legal system allows convictions based on circumstantial evidence, but only when it is strong enough to meet the burden of proof. That burden does not change simply because a case is famous. If anything, the fame of a case makes the burden feel heavier, because everything is being watched and questioned. During this period, prosecutors also relied on witness testimony to establish key elements of their narrative. One of the most important witnesses would become Amber Frey. Her testimony and her recorded phone calls with Scott Peterson became a major part of the case, because they were presented as evidence of deception and motive. The timing of Amber's involvement mattered. Her account of Scott telling her that he had lost his wife, and the fact that this was said before Laci was publicly missing, became one of the prosecution's strongest arguments about Scott's mindset. The defense, of course, had its own approach to this. A defense team will often challenge credibility, context, and interpretation. They will argue that even if a person acted dishonestly, dishonesty is not proof of murder. They will push jurors to separate moral judgment from legal certainty. Behind all of these legal strategies was the reality of a family experiencing loss in public. Laci Peterson's family had to endure not only grief, but repeated exposure. Every stage of the process brought her name back into headlines. Every development extended the story. In many true crime cases, the courtroom becomes the place where grief is replayed under lights, while strangers listen and decide. This stage of the case also reflected something deeper about true crime itself. The public often wants a clean storyline, a single villain, a single reason, a single moment of clarity. But court cases are rarely clean. They are slow. They are technical. They involve competing interpretations of the same facts. And the Peterson case, by the time it reached this stage, was moving toward exactly that kind of courtroom battle. A prosecution determined to show that the evidence led to only one conclusion. A defense determined to show that the case was not strong enough to remove doubt. For the public watching, it may have felt like the trial would finally answer everything. But court does not always bring emotional closure. It brings a legal outcome. It defines responsibility under law, based on evidence and argument. And as the case continued toward trial, the story became less about the missing posters and more about the evidence itself. The timelines, the locations, the recorded conversations, the actions that prosecutors said pointed to guilt, and the alternative explanations the defense said could not be ignored. In the quiet structure of the courtroom, with its formal language and measured pacing, the case was now being prepared for judgment. Not by headlines, not by public instinct, but by a jury asked to weigh what was proven and what was only assumed. And for the people closest to Laci, the hope that once fueled the early search had changed into something else entirely. A need for truth, a need for accountability, and a need to know that her life, and the life that was expected beside hers, would not be reduced to a story without consequence. When the trial began, the atmosphere around the case shifted again. The story that had lived for months in headlines and public debate was now entering a place where rules mattered more than opinions. In court, everything has to be presented in a structured way. Witnesses are sworn in, questions are asked carefully, evidence is admitted or excluded, and the people listening, the jurors, are asked to weigh what is proven rather than what is widely believed. The trial of Scott Peterson became one of the most watched criminal trials of its era. It drew national attention not only because of the tragedy at its center, but because the case was built largely on circumstantial evidence. There was no single moment that could be shown to a jury as the definitive act. Instead, the prosecution aimed to build a picture through many details, arguing that together they led to one clear conclusion. The defense, on the other hand, focused on doubt. They argued that the evidence did not prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They challenged the narrative prosecutors created, pointing to gaps, alternative explanations, and the dangers of a case shaped by intense media coverage. In calm storytelling, it is important to hold both sides clearly and respectfully. Not to suggest that all arguments are equally strong, but to show how each side presented the case, and why jurors had to make decisions based on evidence and legal standards rather than emotion. The prosecution's central argument was that Scott Peterson killed Laci Peterson and disposed of her body in the San Francisco Bay. They argued that he had motive, that he had the opportunity, and that the circumstances surrounding his behavior and movements supported their theory. A major part of the prosecution's narrative centered on Scott's trip to the Barkley Marina on Christmas Eve. According to Scott's own account, he went to the marina to fish. The prosecution presented this trip as suspicious in the context of the case, arguing that it was connected to the later discovery of remains in the same broad region. To support this, prosecutors relied on the timing, the distance from Modesto, and the fact that the bay had already been searched and discussed extensively during the investigation. They argued that this location was not a random detail, but a key part of how the crime was carried out. The prosecution also leaned heavily on the relationship between Scott Peterson and Amber Frey. Amber became a central witness. She testified about the relationship, about Scott's statements, and about the timeline of their contact. The prosecution's aim was to show that Scott was living a double life, and that he had been presenting himself as someone without a wife, even before Laci disappeared. One point that became especially significant was the claim that Scott told Amber he had lost his wife, framing himself as widowed or about to be without a spouse. Prosecutors argued that this showed a mindset already preparing for an ending, and that it supported the idea of motive and planning. Recorded phone calls between Scott and Amber were also introduced. These calls were used to show Scott's behavior and statements during a time when Laci was missing and the case was in the public eye. The prosecution argued that his words and tone in these calls were revealing, not in a vague emotional sense, but as part of a broader pattern of deception. The defense pushed back against this strongly. They argued that the existence of an affair made Scott look morally bad, but that moral failure is not proof of murder. They emphasized that many people commit betrayal without committing violence. Their goal was to keep jurors focused on legal evidence, not personal judgment. The defense also argued that the case against Scott was built on assumptions and interpretation, rather than direct proof. They challenged the prosecution's theory of how the crime occurred. They questioned whether the Bay evidence conclusively tied Scott to the disposal. They argued that the discovery near the Bay did not automatically prove who was responsible. A key theme in the defense's approach was the idea of reasonable doubt. They aimed to show that there were alternative possibilities that could not be ruled out, and that the investigation's focus on Scott may have caused investigators to overlook other leads. One of the broader areas of dispute in the trial involved the timeline of Laci's movements on Christmas Eve, particularly the question of whether Laci was alive after Scott left the home. Some defense arguments and later public discussions suggested that Laci may have been seen by witnesses that morning while walking in the neighborhood. The prosecution challenged these claims and argued that such sightings were unreliable or inconsistent. In missing person cases, witness sightings can be complicated by memory, by timing, and by the way people reinterpret what they think they saw after a case becomes widely known. In court, this kind of dispute becomes a contest of credibility and consistency. The jury has to consider whether witness accounts can be trusted, how they align with other evidence, and whether they support or contradict the prosecution's timeline. The trial also included evidence related to Scott's behavior during the investigation. Prosecutors highlighted actions they said suggested consciousness of guilt. The defense argued that behavior can be misread, especially under pressure and media scrutiny. This is one of the most difficult areas in true crime to interpret calmly, because people expect grief to look a certain way. But grief, stress, and fear do not have one standard expression. A person may appear calm while breaking inside. A person may appear detached while trying not to collapse. And a person may behave strangely for reasons unrelated to guilt. For that reason, behavior evidence is often presented alongside more concrete elements: records, movements, documented actions, and physical evidence. The prosecution did not rely solely on impressions. They relied on a narrative supported by locations, communications, and the overall pattern of the case. A major part of the prosecution's case involved what they argued was preparation and planning. They pointed to events and purchases that they said suggested deliberate intent. The defense challenged these interpretations, arguing that the same facts could be explained in ordinary ways, and that prosecutors were shaping neutral details into suspicious ones. The courtroom process also brought forward experts and investigators who explained what was found, what was recovered, and what could be determined through examination. Because the remains were discovered months after the disappearance, there were limitations in what could be proven. In cases involving water, time, and environment complicates certainty. This is where circumstantial evidence becomes a central issue. Circumstantial cases ask jurors to decide whether the combined weight of evidence points clearly to one person, or whether the gaps leave room for doubt. Outside the courtroom, public opinion continued to swirl, but jurors were instructed to focus only on what was presented in court. This is the legal boundary that matters. A trial is not a referendum on reputation. It is a structured evaluation of evidence. As testimony continued, the prosecution maintained the same essential claim: that Scott Peterson was responsible, and that the evidence supported planning, motive, and opportunity. The defense maintained its core argument as well: that the evidence was not direct, that the investigation was influenced by assumptions, and that reasonable doubt remained. For many observers, the trial felt like two different stories being told over the same set of facts. One story argued that the facts fit together naturally into guilt. The other argued that the facts were being forced into that shape. And this is why juries are so important in the justice system. Because juries are asked to act as the final filter between suspicion and conviction. They listen to both sides. They assess credibility. They consider what is proven. They decide whether the burden of proof has been met. In the Peterson trial, after weeks of testimony, argument, and review of evidence, the case moved toward its verdict. For Laci's family, this meant another long stretch of waiting, but in a different form than before. It was no longer waiting for a phone call or a search update. It was waiting for a decision that would define the legal ending of the story. And as the trial approached its conclusion, the courtroom held the weight of everything that had happened since Christmas Eve. The quiet beginning of the day, the growing search, the media storm, the discovery near the bay, the arrest, and now the final stage, where the law would decide whether the evidence was enough to declare guilt beyond reasonable doubt. This was not a moment of peace, but it was a moment of judgment. And in the next phase of the story, the verdict and sentencing would bring the official outcome, along with the later legal developments that continued to shape how this case is discussed even years afterward. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and argument, the trial reached a point that every criminal case eventually approaches. The moment when everything stops moving forward and instead settles into waiting. The courtroom becomes quieter. The public holds its breath. And the people closest to the case, especially the family of the person who was lost, enter a kind of exhausted stillness. Because a verdict does not restore what was taken. It only answers, in legal terms, who will be held responsible. In November of 2004, the jury returned a verdict. Scott Peterson was found guilty of the murder of Laci Peterson. He was also found guilty in connection with the death of the unborn child. This decision was the result of jurors weighing the evidence presented in court and determining that the prosecution had met the burden of proof beyond reasonable doubt. For Laci's family, the verdict brought a form of closure, but not a gentle one. It did not bring relief in the way people sometimes imagine. It brought finality. It confirmed that the disappearance, the search, and the months of uncertainty had ended in the outcome they feared from the start. For Scott Peterson's side of the story, the verdict meant a different reality. The legal system had reached its conclusion about guilt, and the focus now shifted towards sentencing and the long process that often follows major convictions. Sentencing is the stage where the court determines punishment under the law. It involves legal arguments, recommendations, and the consideration of aggravating and mitigating factors. It is also often a moment where victim impact statements are heard, where the loss is described in human terms, not only as evidence, but as grief. In the Peterson case, Scott Peterson was sentenced to death. That sentence carried enormous weight, not only because of what it meant for him personally, but because of what it meant for the public and for the legal system. Capital punishment cases do not end quickly. They enter years of appeals and legal review, and the case remains present in the courts long after the verdict. When a defendant receives a death sentence, automatic appeals are triggered. Higher courts review the case. They review procedures. They review legal decisions. They assess whether the trial was conducted fairly and whether the law was applied correctly. This does not mean the verdict is automatically questioned in terms of guilt, but it does mean the process is scrutinized, because the consequences are irreversible. Over the years, Scott Peterson's case continued through this appellate process. Like many high-profile cases, it remained in public discussion. Supporters of the conviction saw the verdict as justice. Supporters of the defense argued that the case was built on circumstantial evidence and that the trial had been shaped by a media atmosphere that made fairness difficult. This tension between legal conclusion and public debate became one of the lasting features of the case. Even after the verdict, the case did not fade quietly into history. It stayed alive, re-examined through documentaries, articles, and ongoing conversation. As time passed, legal developments continued. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence. This did not overturn the murder conviction itself. The court upheld the conviction, meaning the finding of guilt remained in place. But the death sentence was set aside due to issues related to jury selection, involving the way potential jurors were questioned and dismissed during the trial. This is an important distinction to state clearly and calmly. The conviction was not erased. The court's decision was about the sentencing phase and whether it met the standards required for the death penalty. Following that decision, the case moved back into the process of resentencing, meaning the court had to determine what the new sentence would be under the law. And in 2021, Scott Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many people, this outcome still felt like severe punishment. For others, it represented a major shift, because the death sentence had been so closely associated with the public memory of the case. But legally, the conviction remained, and the sentence became life without parole. Even after this, the case did not fully settle. In major criminal cases, especially those that remain debated, legal efforts sometimes continue beyond the standard appeal process. Requests for new trials, challenges to evidence, and motions related to newly discovered information can appear over time. These requests are not always successful, and many are denied, but they can keep a case active in the legal system long after a verdict. In the Peterson case, there have been continued legal efforts and public discussion involving claims about evidence, interpretations of witness sightings, and questions about whether alternative scenarios were fully explored. Some of these arguments have been treated by courts as not sufficient to overturn the conviction, while others have been raised in public forums where the standards of proof are different from the standards of law. This is one of the reasons the case remains so widely discussed. It sits at the intersection of courtroom evidence and public storytelling. The public often experiences a case through headlines and documentary narratives. Courts experience it through filings, testimony, procedure, and legal standards. And those two experiences do not always feel the same. For Laci Peterson's family, however, the legal debates do not change the central reality. A person was lost. A child that was expected was lost. And whatever legal outcomes follow, that grief remains in the background, steady and permanent. There is also a deeper reason this case left such a strong imprint on public memory. It was not only the tragedy itself, but the way it unfolded in full view. The search became national. The husband became a subject of suspicion before the legal system reached its conclusion. The affair became a defining piece of public judgment, and the entire story became a kind of mirror, reflecting how quickly a private life can become a public spectacle. True crime cases often become lessons in hindsight. People look back and say they saw the signs. They say the ending was obvious. They say the outcome was inevitable. But living through an investigation in real time rarely feels that clear. It feels uncertain. It feels slow. It feels filled with incomplete information, shaped by fear and hope at the same time. The legal system eventually places a stamp of conclusion on the question of guilt. But the human story remains more complicated. It includes the missing posters and the searchers. It includes the people who loved Laci and waited for her. It includes a community that carried the weight of watching a pregnancy turn into a tragedy. And it includes the lingering discomfort of a case that became famous because it felt like it could happen anywhere. By the time the later legal developments arrived, many years had passed since Christmas Eve of 2002. The world had changed. Media had changed. Public attention had moved to newer stories. But for those closest to the case, time had not softened the loss into something distant. It had only placed it inside a longer timeline of living without someone who should still be here. And now, with the verdict established and the sentence settled into life without parole, the legal story reached a kind of final shape. Not a perfect shape, not one that pleases everyone, but one that stands under law. A verdict, a sentence. a permanent record of what the court concluded, and a name that remains, not only in true crime history, but in the memory of those who knew her before the world did. As the story settles into silence, it is natural to feel the weight of it in a quiet way. Not as shock, and not as spectacle, but as something softer and heavier. The kind of sadness that arrives when you remember that behind every headline is a real person, and behind every case is a family that has to wake up the next morning and continue living. The case of Laci Peterson became widely known, repeated across years, discussed in courtrooms, documentaries, and public conversations. But before it was any of that, it was a life in a home in Modesto, surrounded by ordinary plans and ordinary routines, at the edge of a holiday season. It was a pregnancy filled with expectation. It was the gentle hope of a child who had not yet entered the world. And that is what makes this kind of story difficult to hold, because it reminds us of something we do not like to sit with for too long. That life can change without warning. That safety can feel real right up until the moment it proves fragile. That even in places that seem familiar and stable, tragedy can still arrive quietly. In the end, the legal system provided its conclusion. A verdict was reached, a sentence was given, and the case moved into the long category of stories that are now officially finished in court, even if they never feel finished in the human heart. But closure, in true crime, is never the same as peace. It is simply the moment when the world stops asking who will be held responsible and starts living with the answer. For the people close to Laci, the answer does not bring her back. It does not restore the future that was being imagined. It only draws a line under the question, so that grief can stop spinning in uncertainty and settle into something more permanent. If you have listened to this story tonight, you have done something simple but meaningful. You have given your attention quietly. You have allowed the facts to be heard without turning them into entertainment. You have listened with respect, and that matters, because the way we speak about these stories shapes what they become. Some stories are told loudly, chasing drama, but the truth is that real tragedy does not need to be made louder. It is already heavy enough. So tonight, we let this story rest gently. We let it return to where it belongs, not in the noise of endless debate, but in the quiet recognition that a life was lost, and that the world should have been kinder, that the season should have stayed peaceful, that the home should have remained safe. And if there is anything to take from a story like this, it is not fear. It is awareness, the calm reminder to cherish the people you love while they are here, to pay attention to the small signs that something feels wrong, to trust the quiet instincts that sometimes speak before the mind can explain, and also to remember that people are not headlines. They are full lives. They are voices and laughter and habits and hopes. They are unfinished plans and unspoken sentences. They are the ordinary miracles of daily living, which only become visible when they are gone. Now, as we come to the end of this episode, there is nothing left for you to do. There is no question you need to hold on to, no detail you need to remember. The story can remain on the other side of your sleep, distant and softened by darkness. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. If your thoughts are still moving, let them slow down, one at a time. You can return your attention to the simple things, the quiet air in the room, the softness of your blanket, the steady rhythm of your breathing. Inhale slowly and exhale. You are safe in this moment. You are here. The day is over. The night is allowed to be calm. Let your shoulders loosen again, the way you would loosen a grip that has been held too tightly. Let your forehead smooth. Let your hands rest. And if sleep comes quickly, you can let it take you. You do not need to stay awake for anything else. You can drift without effort, the way a thought fades when it is no longer needed. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me. And wherever you are listening from tonight, I hope the rest of your night is gentle. Good night.